for the communist system. But they've been really liberalized for so many years and adopted so many of the communist policies that there wasn't much difference between them. And remember the Rees Commission, I mention this so often because Norman Dodd is up on YouTube giving a talk. He was the representative who was sent from the Congress to look into foundations, their power and influence. That's also the name of a book that came out about it. And they wondered why the big foundations owned by the richest men in the world, big international bankers, big magnates of power in industry worldwide, why these foundations based in America would be funding what seemed to them to be left-wing or ultra-left-wing or really communist non-governmental organizations with agendas that were definitely communistic. And he was told by the CEO of the Ford Foundation and others that their job was to so alter the culture within the United States and Western Europe that down the road, years down the road, they could blend it seamlessly with that of the Soviet Union. And to be honest with you, I think they pretty well achieved that goal. If you go into the writings of Lenin, Lenin did not say that the dictatorship over the proletariat, the people, would last forever. He didn't say that at all. He said that maybe 70 years down the road, he said, the Soviet system, this dictatorship will merge into a new system because of the conflicts with the West and capitalism. And it would merge so well that it would be neither communistic nor capitalistic. Well, the term they're using now openly is really what they were after in the first place, a world socialist society. In socialism, the big banking boys, the richest people in the world can still be part of the system and still help run it, in fact. And they can still get all their socialistic policies in. That sound really nice on the surface, and some of them certainly have helped public who've been put on unemployment or lost their jobs. That kind of stuff, basic stuff, that was definitely necessary. However, it was really for control over entire societies. If we remember that the Marxist system demanded centralization of power, and we saw that happening not only in the Soviet system, we saw it happening too across Europe. Centralization of power as the main capital of each country took over all policing rights over all police, rights of sole taxation, rights to do with travel across the country. All your departments, for instance, in Canada, are federalized for travel. You have a tax sticker to travel in your car. You have a registration form to fill out for the federal government to do with travel. It's all federalized now. And all the provinces, which are just states in Canada, just like the US, are now answerable to the federal governmental system. That was all planned, as I say. And once they had set up a centralized system, they said over 100 years ago that eventually they would start making treaties between those centralized governmental systems of power with each other. And then they would start integrating each other's centralized system under a unified command. That's what they meant by a new world order, run from a world governmental system. The League of Nations was set up initially to be the embryo of it. They knew they wouldn't have all the full powers of it. That blossomed into the United Nations, and today everything goes through the United Nations. People don't know that if you build a house, every building code to do with the foundations, the plumbing, the electricity, everything in that house, every building code comes from the United Nations. They're responsible for the same codes now for across the whole planet. For every department you have in your federal government, every single department, you have an equivalent department set up at the United Nations that deals not only with your government, and liaises with those departments in your government, but also liaises with all the other departments, similar ones, across the world and every other country. That's what it was set up to be. And yet, if you go into the long-term projections by think tanks, the big think tanks, the futurist ones, the ones that work again with the Club of Rome and all the biggie boys, the ones that work with the Department of Defense for Britain, NATO, and for the US governments, and look at the projections for the next 50 years or so, which they've published and are on my archives at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. You will find that they talk about this integrated system that's to come in and the chaos that would cause in the meantime. And it also talks about the fact that a world government won't last for more than probably 20 years. And they already have it set up where they're going from there. Back after this break. Hi folks, I'm Alan Watson. This is Cutting Through the Matrix. Just discussing how we get led along a path in a lifetime. Each one of us lives this X amount of years. We're fed information of the reality that we think we're living in. But most folk never realize, and they're certainly not encouraged to realize, that every major event in their life was planned that way by people in think tanks and organizations which they'll sometimes never hear of if they don't look up and do their own self-education. And when I'm talking about major things, I'm talking about even the wars that they have. Sometimes if you go into the writings of the think tanks for Department of Defense, for instance, they'll talk about wars that'll come along in 10 or 20 years' time in certain areas, or what they call regions now. They broke the world up into regions at the United Nations. And that's why all this war on terror is all part of a strategy to not only guide us through, bring us through by force actually, into this new system, and where we're not going to have democracy as we ever knew it, or the rights that we ever had before. That's not going to come back. In a sense, it's a form of perpetual war, and it has been called perpetual war by the United States military themselves in their own publications. And again, I have them on my archive section at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Perpetual war. Only under warfare tactics do the public allow themselves to be guided or ruled under authoritarian systems. Only then do you sacrifice by having less income, perhaps even rationing of food, restriction of travel, ID cards, that kind of stuff. And the guys who dreamed up this idea for this time right now we're going through were the Club of Rome boys. They were given the task by the biggies, those internationalists who rule the world through finance and commerce, working with governments. They were given the task of finding ways to get the public to basically give up all the values that they used to hold near and dear, such as private property, the right to decide what kind of work or employment they would like to study and go towards, where they'd like to work, in which countries they'd like to work, especially their own, and basically carve out a place for themselves in the world, doing something they like to do. In this new system, a totalitarian system, we're not going to be allowed that. We're under a war scenario. You will sacrifice. We are sacrificing. And because they keep shouting terror, terror all the time, we've given up more rights than probably 12 revolutions down through history in different areas have ever given us. They've taken them all literally away from us. They've created so many layers of authoritarian military-style organizations that you can't even keep up with them all. We are at a stage that Lenin talked about where he said in the West, towards the end of the year 2000, he said there'll be so many departments, authority-type departments in the Western world that they'll all be standing on each other's toes in their own territories, like too many of them. We already are there. You'll find even when it comes to major terror alerts and so on, that maybe a dozen types of SWAT teams will turn up. So many different agencies will turn up. It's happening in Britain as well, where 30 cars at one point turned up with helicopters for a domestic dispute. And then they start squabbling amongst themselves to see who's going to do the kill. Literally, this is what it's come down to. But not only that, they've been given the authority to do this. This is the projection, as I say, of the Club of Rome, done back in the 70s, when they did their first book. Not their first book, but the second book. It was called The First Global Revolution. And they said that they were given the task of finding ways to get public to give up their rights. And that's what they picked on, a war on something, or an outside threat of something. So they picked on terror, obviously.